The cabin looked abandoned, but the fresh tire tracks in the mud said someone had been there first. The gravel crunches behind the cabin. Walter freezes. Ranger's ears snap forward. There, in the damp soil near the dip in the yard, a set of tire tracks cuts across the grass, sharp edges, still fresh. No one was supposed to know he was coming up here. And yet someone had already tested the road. Why would a worthless piece of land draw that kind of attention? Would you have stayed or driven away? The pallet hit the concrete harder than it should have. It wasn't the sound itself. Warehouses are loud. Forklifts beep. Chains rattle. Metal scrapes. But when that load slipped and slammed down behind him, something inside Walter Hayes snapped tight, like wire pulled too far. His body moved before his mind did. He dropped low, turned sharp, eyes scanning for contact, breathing already shallow, fast. The fluorescent lights above him flickered, and for half a second, the loading dock wasn't a loading dock anymore. It was dust and heat and a blown-out wall somewhere he did not want to remember. "Walter!" The shift supervisor's voice cut through it. Not gunfire. Not shouting over a radio. Just a man in a safety vest, staring. Walter realized he was crouched behind a stack of boxed appliances, one hand gripping a steel pry bar like it meant something. The forklift driver stood frozen, pale. "It slipped," the kid said. "That's all." Walter stood slowly, set the pry bar down, nodded once. "I know." But he didn't know. Not in the way that mattered. They let him finish the shift. No yelling, no scene. Just a quiet meeting in the small office near the break room. The words were careful. Liability. Workplace safety. Not a good fit. By the time he stepped into the parking lot, Ranger was already standing in the back of the old pickup, tail low, watching the door like he'd been waiting for a signal. Walter opened the truck door and sat for a minute before turning the key. Ranger leaned forward and rested his chin on Walter's shoulder. "It's fine," Walter said, though he hadn't decided yet if that was true. 3 days later, he sat in a different kind of office. This one smelled like old carpet and printer ink, framed degrees on the wall, a window that looked out over the courthouse square. Walter wore the only button-down shirt he still owned that didn't feel too tight across the shoulders. Ranger lay at his boots, calm, alert, ears shifting at every small movement in the room. The lawyer, Mr. Dalton, cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. Across the table sat 2 of Walter's distant relatives, people he saw at funerals and nowhere else. Marlene folded her hands in her lap. Cliff leaned back in his chair like he already knew how this would end. "As outlined in the will," Mr. Dalton said, voice flat and steady, "the property located on Ridge Hollow Road transfers in full to Mr. Walter Hayes." Cliff snorted. "You're kidding." Marlene didn't laugh out loud. She smiled the way people do when they don't want to look cruel. "That place?" she said softly. "It's nothing but weeds and back taxes." Walter didn't look at them. He kept his eyes on the lawyer. Mr. Dalton continued. "The transfer includes the cabin structure, the surrounding acreage and all recorded property rights, including a documented access easement." Cliff leaned forward now. "Access to what?" he asked. The lawyer glanced at the papers. "There is a recorded right-of-way across the parcel, filed in county records in 1978. It remains valid." Silence settled over the table. Not the awkward kind. The measuring kind. Walter felt Ranger shift slightly at his feet. Not restless, just attentive. Marlene turned toward him. "Walter, you don't have to take it. Honestly, it's more trouble than it's worth. That road barely exists anymore. You'll spend more fixing the place than it'll ever bring back." Cliff added, "If you want out, we can talk. Keep it in the family. Save you the headache." Walter finally looked up. He'd learned a long time ago that the loudest voice in a room wasn't always the one to watch. It was the one that went quiet when something unexpected was said. Cliff had laughed at the cabin. But when the lawyer mentioned the easement, Cliff had stopped smiling. "Full transfer," Walter said, as if testing the weight of the words. "Yes," Mr. Dalton replied. "Everything as written." Walter nodded once. "I'll take it." Cliff leaned back again, but the ease was gone. "Suit yourself." The meeting ended quickly after that. Papers signed. A thin brass key slid across the desk. Walter picked it up. It was lighter than he expected. Scratched on one side. Ordinary. People thought land felt heavy. It didn't. Not until you stood on it. Outside, the afternoon sun washed the square in pale light. Marlene paused near the steps. "You really going to drive up there?" she asked. Walter clipped the key onto his ring. "Yeah." Cliff shook his head. "It's a dead ridge. Has been for years." Ranger rose when Walter did. He stepped close to Walter's left leg, shoulder brushing denim. Walter opened the truck door and let Ranger climb in first. As he settled behind the wheel, he caught his reflection in the rearview mirror. A man in his early 40s, short hair going gray at the edges, lines around the eyes that hadn't been there before. Fired and broke. That's what Cliff would call him now. He started the engine. The truck idled rough, familiar, honest. Ranger's ears twitched toward the courthouse behind them, then toward the road leading out of town. Walter rested his hand on the steering wheel and thought about the word the lawyer had used. Access. If the place was worthless, no one would have bothered to record a right-of-way. He shifted into gear. As the courthouse square disappeared in the rearview mirror, Ranger stood in the seat beside him and stared forward, steady and intent. Walter didn't know what waited on that ridge, but for the first time in days, the noise in his head had quieted just a little. Somewhere beyond town limits, beyond the last gas station and the stretch of worn highway, there was a cabin no one wanted, and a piece of land that had been quiet long enough. Walter drove toward it. Behind him, the laughter from the office felt smaller. Ahead, the road narrowed, and somewhere in the back of his mind, the question stayed with him. If it was truly nothing, why had they all cared so much? The question stayed with Walter as the highway narrowed and the hills began to fold in around him. Town gave way to pasture. Pasture gave way to hardwood forest. The last cell signal bar blinked once, then disappeared. Ranger stood with his front paws braced against the dash, watching the road like he expected it to answer something. The turnoff to Ridge Hollow Road was easy to miss. A rusted sign half swallowed by vines, gravel washed thin by rain. Walter slowed, then eased the truck onto the narrow drive. The tires crunched over stone. Branches brushed the sides of the cab. The farther they went, the quieter it became. No houses, no mailboxes, just trees closing in like they had no intention of moving aside. After a mile, the road thinned to two pale tracks through grass. And then he saw it. The cabin sat crooked on the slope. Gray wood faded almost silver. Tin patched across part of the roof. One corner of the porch sagged a few inches lower than the rest. Windows filmed over with dust. It didn't look angry. It looked forgotten. Walter parked and cut the engine. The silence that followed felt thick. Not peaceful, just deep. Ranger jumped down first. He didn't run. He circled once, nose low, reading the ground like a book written in scent. Walter stepped out slowly. The air smelled like damp leaves and old timber. He stood there for a moment, taking it in. Not judging, just measuring. The porch boards creaked under his weight, but held. The key turned stiff in the lock. Inside, the cabin smelled closed up, dry wood, Old fabric. A faint trace of something metallic near the sink. Light pushed through the dusty windows in thin stripes. There was a table, two mismatched chairs, a cast-iron stove in the corner. Nothing dramatic, nothing grand. Just space. Walter walked the perimeter the way he always did when entering a new place. Doorways, windows, sightlines. Habit didn't leave just because uniforms did. Ranger followed, quiet, tail level, ears working. Clear, Walter muttered under his breath, but it didn't feel clear yet. He stepped back outside. The yard sloped down behind the cabin, grass waist high in spots. Beyond it, a line of trees thickened toward the ridge. Ranger had already moved in that direction. "Easy," Walter called. The dog paused, looked back, then continued forward at a steady walk. Not chasing anything, not excited. Just purposeful. Walter followed. About 30 yards behind the cabin, the grass thinned near a shallow dip in the ground. Ranger stopped there and lowered his nose, inhaling slow. Then he took 3 steps to the left, stopped again. Walter scanned the area. He didn't see much, just uneven earth and a faint line where the vegetation grew differently. "Probably deer," he said. Ranger didn't respond. He stood still, facing uphill, as if waiting. Walter crouched and ran his hand through the grass. Underneath, the soil felt firmer, packed, not soft like the rest of the yard. He stood again. "Later," he said. "We'll look later." The sun was already dropping behind the ridge. He had enough to handle for one day. Inside, he opened windows, propped the back door, found an old broom leaning behind the stove and swept a rough path across the floor. Ranger lay near the doorway, watching everything. As evening settled in, the woods changed sound. Daybirds quieted. Something smaller moved in the brush. Wind pushed softly against the tin roof. Walter heated a can of soup on the stove and ate standing up. When night came, it came fast. He spread his old sleeping bag on the narrow bed in the back room. Ranger chose the spot at the base of the doorway where he could see both the front entrance and the back hall. Walter lay on his back and stared at the ceiling. The quiet was different from town quiet. It wasn't distant traffic or the hum of power lines. It was the kind that let every small sound step forward. A branch shifted outside. His eyes opened instantly. For a second, he didn't know where he was. His hand moved toward the edge of the bed, reaching for a rifle that wasn't there. Only his flashlight rested on the crate beside him. He grabbed it, rolled to his side, listened. Nothing. Just wind. Ranger lifted his head but didn't growl. Walter sat up slowly and breathed through his nose. In for 4, out for 4, the way someone had once shown him when sleep refused to come. "Not Afghanistan," he murmured. "Kentucky." He stood and walked to the back door, opened it an inch. Cold air slid inside. The yard lay still under the moonlight. Grass silver, trees dark and unmoving. Then he saw it. Not movement, not an animal. A set of tire impressions in the soft ground near the side of the clearing. Faint, but there. He stepped outside and shone the light low across the earth. The tracks were not old enough to be from years ago. The edges were still sharp. Walter crouched and pressed 2 fingers into one of the grooves. The soil crumbled slightly, still loose. Ranger moved to his side and sniffed the same spot. His posture stiffened. Tail went still. Walter stood slowly. No one had known he was coming up today. Not officially. He swept the flashlight beam toward the tree line behind the cabin. Nothing looked disturbed. But something had been here. The wind picked up, brushing across the grass in a slow wave. Walter shut the back door and locked it. He didn't say anything out loud this time. He didn't need to. As he lay back down, Ranger shifted closer to the bed, not at the doorway now, but near Walter's boots. The cabin felt less empty, and the land felt less forgotten. Somewhere beyond the trees, the ridge waited in silence, and for the first time since the lawyer's office, Walter felt it. This wasn't about weeds. Someone else had already walked this ground. The question wasn't whether the land mattered. The question was who else believed it did. Walter did not sleep much after that. He lay there listening to the cabin settle, the roof ticking as the night cooled. Ranger stayed close, not restless, just aware. Every time a branch shifted or something small moved in the brush, Walter's eyes opened. By first light, he was already outside. The air carried that thin, mountain chill that makes everything feel sharper than it is. Mist clung low over the grass behind the cabin. The tire marks he had seen the night before were still there, clearer now. He crouched beside them, not wide like a farm truck, not narrow like an ATV either. Mid-sized tires, deep tread, fresh enough that the edges hadn't rounded off. Ranger stepped beside him and lowered his head, sniffing slowly along the groove. His body went rigid again. Not fear. Recognition. Walter studied the tracks the way he used to study boot prints in dust. He traced their direction with his eyes. They hadn't come from the main drive. They had cut in from the side, near the tree line. "Why there?" he murmured. Ranger lifted his head and looked toward the ridge, ears forward. Walter followed the direction of that stare. The slope behind the cabin rose gently at first, then thickened into hardwood and pine. Somewhere beyond that was the parcel the lawyer had mentioned, the one tied to the easement. He stood and walked the line of the tracks. They didn't go all the way to the porch. They had stopped near the shallow dip in the yard, where Ranger had paused the day before. Walter felt the shift in his chest. Slow, controlled. He moved toward that dip again. In the morning light, the difference in the ground was clearer. A faint strip ran uphill through the grass. Firmer soil, less growth. He scraped the toe of his boot across it. Pale gravel flashed beneath the dirt. Ranger stepped onto the strip and stood still, as if waiting for a command. Walter didn't give one. Instead, he walked the faint line up toward the trees. It wasn't obvious, not a road, not anymore. But it wasn't random either. It curved in a steady arc toward the ridge. About halfway up, he stopped. The grass on either side bent differently. Something heavy had pressed through here recently. Not enough to leave a deep rut, just enough to disturb the growth. Ranger sniffed the air and let out a low sound. Not a bark, not a growl, a warning rumble that stayed in his chest. Walter turned slowly, scanning the woods. Nothing moved, but he felt it. That small tightening behind the ribs, the sense of not being alone in a place that should have been empty. He exhaled once and looked down at the ground again. "Not jumping to conclusions," he said softly. That was the rule now. No contact until confirmed. Back at the cabin, he grabbed a small spiral notebook from his truck, sat at the table and began writing. Date, time, location of tracks, direction of entry. He didn't know who he was writing it for, maybe just for himself. Facts felt steadier on paper than they did in his head. By mid-morning, he decided he needed more than suspicion. He drove back toward town with Ranger riding shotgun, head up, watching the road behind them as much as ahead. Russell County wasn't large. One main strip of storefronts, a hardware store, a diner, a bank that closed early on Fridays. Walter parked near the diner first. Inside, the bell over the door chimed when he entered. Conversations dipped slightly. Ranger moved close to his knee, calm and disciplined. A man at the counter turned and squinted. "You the one staying up on Ridge Hollow?" he asked. Walter nodded once. "For now." The man shrugged. Didn't think anybody cared about that place anymore. Seems like somebody does, Walter replied evenly. The man gave a short laugh. Developers sniffing around up past the ridge. Heard Crockett's been buying up timber lots, trying to connect parcels. Hard ground up there. Expensive to cut new road. Walter felt something click into place. Crockett, he repeated. Yeah, the man said. Heard they've been talking to folks. Quiet like. Walter didn't push further. He finished his coffee and headed for the county office next. The records room was plain. Fluorescent lights, filing cabinets, a counter with a woman behind it who looked like she'd been there long enough to remember half the town's history. He gave her the parcel number from the deed. She pulled it up on the computer and turned the screen slightly so he could see. There's the main lot, she said. Cabin acreage. And here, this thin strip. That's the recorded easement. Filed 78. Still active. Active how? Walter asked. It means it's legal, she said. If someone owns the back parcel, they have right to use that access unless it's renegotiated. Runs straight through your land. Walter leaned closer. The line on the screen matched the faint strip in the grass almost exactly. And who owns the parcel behind mine? He asked. She clicked again. A new number appeared. Crockett Timber Holdings, she said. There it was. Walter nodded slowly. Anybody request updated survey on my lot recently? She checked. Not on yours. On the parcel behind. Last month. Walter stepped back. Outside, Ranger was already watching the parking lot. A dark pickup sat across the street. Engine off. Windows tinted enough that you couldn't see inside clearly. Walter didn't stare at it. He'd learned not to. He scratched Ranger behind the ear. Okay, he murmured. The pieces weren't dramatic. No shouting. No threats. Just a cabin. A thin strip of land. A company buying up ground behind him. And fresh tire marks where the easement should have been. As they pulled out of town, Walter checked the mirror once. The dark pickup stayed parked. But the feeling didn't. Back at the cabin, the ridge looked the same as it had that morning. Quiet. Ordinary. Ranger jumped out before the truck fully stopped and trotted toward the dip in the yard again. Walter followed. He stood on the faint roadbed and let his eyes trace the curve up toward the trees. The land didn't look valuable. It looked patient. And patience, he knew, was often mistaken for weakness. He looked down at Ranger, who stood square on the gravel hidden under grass, steady as a marker. Guess we're not alone, Walter said quietly. Ranger's ears flicked once. Somewhere beyond the ridge, someone had already decided this strip of ground mattered. The only question left was how far they were willing to go to get it. Walter stood on the faint strip of gravel cutting through the grass and let that thought settle. Ranger didn't move. He stayed planted on the old roadbed like it meant something more than dirt. Walter looked uphill toward the trees, then downhill toward the cabin. If it runs clean, he muttered, it runs both ways. He spent the next hour walking the length of the easement as best he could see it. Not fast, not wandering. Just steady steps, following the subtle curve in the ground. Every few yards, he scraped back grass with the toe of his boot. Gravel flashed again and again, buried but consistent. It wasn't imagination. The line was real. Back at the cabin, he pulled the deed folder from his truck and spread it across the kitchen table. The paper felt thin compared to the weight of what it implied. Easement recorded 1978. He didn't know who had filed it, didn't know what agreement had been made. But he knew one thing now. Crockett Timber didn't need the cabin. They needed the path. Ranger lay near the open back door, head up, watching the yard. Walter stepped outside with a tape measure and walked off the distance from the cabin to where the roadbed dipped toward the trees. Not because he needed exact numbers, because measuring something made it tangible. Halfway through, Ranger's ears snapped forward. Walter didn't turn immediately. He listened first. A low hum carried faintly through the trees. Engine. Not on the main drive. Off to the right, near the tree line. He walked toward the sound slowly. Through a break in the brush, he caught a glimpse of movement. A dark pickup easing along the edge of the upper ridge. Not speeding, not hiding, just testing. The truck stopped briefly, then continued forward out of sight. Walter exhaled once. "Yeah," he said quietly. "You care." Ranger let out a low, contained bark. Not loud, just enough. Walter didn't chase it, didn't wave, didn't announce himself. Instead, he turned back toward the cabin. If someone wanted access, they were going to need to speak to him. His phone buzzed as he stepped inside. Unknown number. He let it ring once more before answering. "This is Walter." A pause. "Mr. Hayes," the voice said. Smooth. Professional. "Cliff Benton here. I heard you made it up to Ridge Hollow." Walter leaned against the counter. "I did. Thought I'd save you some trouble. That land's not going to be easy to manage. Roads washed out in places. Taxes stack up quick. If you're interested, we could make this simple." Walter watched Ranger walk to the doorway and sit square, eyes on the yard. "Simple how?" Walter asked. "We'd be willing to purchase the parcel outright. 30,000. Cash. Close fast. No headaches." 30,000. Walter let the number hang in the air. "For weeds?" he asked. Cliff chuckled lightly. "It's more than weeds, sure, but not enough to make your life easier. Trust me." Walter studied the tone more than the words. "You mentioned access," Walter said. "What do you need access to?" Another pause, shorter this time. "There's development interest in the upper tract," Cliff replied. "Just routine timber work, nothing dramatic." Routine. Walter glanced at the easement paperwork on the table. "If it's routine," he said calmly, "why not build a road from your own side?" The line went quiet. "Terrain's rough up there," Cliff said finally. "Cuts costs to use what's already in place." There it was. Walter didn't raise his voice. "I'm not selling," he said. "Think it over," Cliff replied, tone cooling just a degree. "Offers like this don't always stay on the table." Walter ended the call without answering that. He stood in the kitchen a long moment, the phone still in his hand. Ranger shifted closer. "Not selling," Walter repeated quietly. Outside, wind pushed through the grass along the old roadbed. It moved in a line, almost tracing the buried path for him. He stepped onto the porch and looked out across the slope. The cabin still looked small, still looked tired, but it no longer looked meaningless. It looked positioned. That changed everything. Late afternoon light filtered through the trees as Walter walked back to the dip in the yard. He knelt and ran his hand across the gravel again. Someone had already started testing it. Driving light, checking ground firmness, measuring cost. He knew that pattern. Probe, assess, advance. But this wasn't a battlefield. This was paperwork and patience. Ranger moved beside him and stood facing uphill again. Same direction as before. Same quiet insistence. Walter followed his gaze and saw it now. Higher up the slope, just beyond where the gravel thinned, a small wooden stake stood half hidden near the brush. Not old. Clean cut. Recently driven. He hadn't noticed it before. He walked toward it slowly. No company logo, no marking tape. Just a fresh post where no post had been yesterday. Walter pulled it from the ground with one steady tug. It came free easier than it should have. He held it for a second, then laid it flat across the roadbed. "You don't get to mark what isn't yours," he said softly. The ridge answered with silence, but the tension had shifted. It was no longer about suspicion. It was about confirmation. Back inside, Walter pulled a legal pad from his truck and wrote down everything. Time of call, offer amount, exact wording. He wasn't reacting out of anger. He was documenting. Ranger lay near his boots while he wrote, steady and grounded. Outside, the light faded behind the trees. Walter looked once more at the easement line drawn thin across the deed. 30,000 wasn't an insult. It was a hurry. And hurry meant leverage. He folded the paperwork carefully and set it back inside the folder. As night settled over Ridge Hollow again, the cabin felt different than it had the day before. Not lonelier, more occupied. Walter stepped onto the porch one last time before turning in. The woods were dark, the slope quiet. Somewhere beyond that ridge, Crockett Timber was running numbers, and for the first time in a long while, Walter Hayes felt something steady under his feet. Not fear, not anger. Ground. Ranger came to stand beside him, shoulder touching denim. Walter looked down at the old road cutting through grass. "They want the path," he murmured. Ranger didn't move. Walter nodded once. "Then we guard the path." Walter said it low, almost to himself. Ranger's ears flicked once, like he understood the weight behind it. Morning came with thin gray light and a cold wind sliding down the ridge. Walter was already outside before the sun cleared the tree line. He carried a thermos and a shovel, not to dig trenches, just to clear enough grass from the roadbed to see it clean. Ranger moved ahead of him, checking the yard first, nose low, tail level. Walter scraped back another stretch of grass along the buried gravel. The strip looked clearer now. Intentional, straight. It didn't take long for the sound to reach them. Gravel under tires. Not the faint hum from the ridge this time. Direct. Close. Walter straightened slowly. A silver SUV rolled through the front gate without hesitation. It didn't stop at the mailbox. It didn't pause to look around. It drove straight toward the cabin. Ranger stepped in front of Walter without being told. Not lunging, not barking, just placing himself square. The SUV stopped 20 feet from the porch. The engine cut off. Doors opened. Cliff Benton stepped out first, smiling like they were meeting at a church picnic. Behind him came a woman in her early 50s, sharp eyes, pressed blouse. Marlene. She glanced at the cabin, then at the slope behind it. "Walter," Cliff called. "Morning." Walter didn't move toward them. "Gate was open," Cliff added lightly. "It wasn't an invitation," Walter replied. Marlene gave a small laugh. "We just wanted to talk face to face, easier than phone calls." Cliff took a few steps closer. Ranger shifted his weight forward. A low sound rose from his chest. Cliff stopped. "Easy there," he said. "Good dog." "He is," Walter answered. "So keep your distance." There was a beat of silence. Wind moved through the grass behind them, tracing the old roadbed like a line drawn by memory. Cliff nodded once, recalculating. 30,000, he said. "That's not a lowball. It's fair. Cash. We close quick. You walk away clean." Walter took a slow sip from his thermos. "From weeds?" he asked. Marlene crossed her arms. "From taxes. From maintenance. From isolation. That cabin's not wired for modern heat. Roof's patched. Water lines old. You'll sink more into it than it'll ever give back." Walter didn't argue those points. They weren't wrong, but they weren't the whole picture. "And the easement?" he asked. Cliff's jaw tightened for just a second. "It's paperwork," he said. "Nothing dramatic. Just to strip through your land. For who? For whoever needs it. Walter held his gaze. Crockett? He asked. Silence. Marlene stepped in smoothly. Crockett's been looking at the upper tract. That's public information. No secret there. And they'd save money using this road, Walter said calmly. Cliff's smile thinned. Terrain's rough on the north side, he admitted. Building fresh access costs. That's just business. Business, Walter repeated. Ranger shifted again, stepping slightly to the left. Not random, blocking the angle between Cliff and the slope. Cliff noticed. You think we're trying to cheat you? He asked. I think you're in a hurry, Walter replied. Marlene's eyes flicked to the cleared strip of gravel behind him. You've been digging, she said. Looking, Walter corrected. Cliff's voice dropped half a notch. Offers don't always improve, he said. Companies move on. You hold out too long, you're left with land nobody wants. Walter looked past him at the SUV, clean tires, fresh tread. Funny, he said. Nobody wanted it until I did. The wind picked up, pushing loose grass across the roadbed. Ranger didn't blink. Marlene softened her tone. Walter, listen. We're family. We'd rather keep this internal. Avoid strangers walking through here. Survey crews, timber guys, lawyers. There it was. Lawyers. Walter nodded once. If someone wants to discuss access, he said evenly, they can do it with everything in writing, through representation. Cliff's smile faded completely now. So that's how it's going to be. That's how it's going to be. The standoff wasn't loud. No shouting, no threats. Just 3 adults standing in a yard, measuring each other. Cliff glanced at Ranger again. That dog won't stop a contract, he said. No, Walter agreed. But he'll let me know when someone crosses a line. Marlene looked at Walter carefully. You planning to live up here full time? For now. You don't strike me as a farmer. Walter met her eyes. I don't have to be. Silence settled again. Thicker this time. Cliff exhaled through his nose. 35, he said suddenly. Last adjustment. Too fast. Walter didn't even hesitate. No. Cliff's jaw set. You're going to regret that. Maybe, Walter said. But not today. For a second, something flashed in Cliff's eyes. Frustration. Not anger exactly. Pressure. He turned back toward the SUV. We tried, he muttered to Marlene. They got in without another word. The engine started. Tires spun slightly as they turned in the soft gravel near the dip in the yard. Walter watched the back tires closely. They lined up almost perfectly with the older impressions he'd seen the night before. The SUV rolled out through the gate and disappeared down the drive. Silence returned. But it didn't feel empty anymore. Walter walked slowly to the dip in the yard and crouched beside the fresh tire marks. Ranger stood over his shoulder, staring toward the trees. They were testing, Walter said quietly. Not just him, the ground. He ran his fingers along the groove in the soil, pressed deeper this time. The gravel underneath was firm, capable of carrying weight. He stood and looked uphill again. This wasn't about emotion. It was math. If Crockett needed access, and this strip was the cheapest route, then the value wasn't in the cabin. It was in control. Ranger stepped forward and let out a single sharp bark toward the tree line. Walter followed his gaze. For a moment, he thought he saw movement higher up the ridge. Just a flicker, a shadow slipping between trunks. Maybe wind, maybe not. He didn't chase it. He didn't call out. Instead, he walked back to the porch and picked up the wooden stake he had pulled from the ground the day before. He drove it firmly into the earth at the edge of the roadbed. Not as a warning, as a marker. Then he went inside and pulled his notebook back out. Offer increased to 35,000. 5 chun. In-person visit. Mention of Crockett confirmed. He wrote slowly, clearly. No rush. Ranger lay beside the table, calm again, breathing steady. Outside, the ridge stood silent, but the pace had changed. They were no longer pretending the land was worthless. They were negotiating, and that meant the path mattered more than they were willing to admit. Walter felt it in the way Cliff's offer had jumped. 30, then 35. Too fast, too eager. Money wasn't the pressure. Time was. By late afternoon, the wind had settled. The ridge went quiet in that way it does before dusk. Not peaceful, just waiting. Walter grabbed his flashlight and walked the easement again. Ranger moved ahead of him, staying on the thin line of gravel that cut through the grass. They reached the dip near the tree line just as the sun dropped low enough to stretch long shadows across the yard. That's when Ranger stopped hard. No warning bark this time. He froze mid-step, ears high, head angled slightly to the right. Walter slowed. What is it? Ranger took 2 careful steps forward and then jerked back with a sharp yelp. The sound hit Walter like a crack in his chest. Ranger! He moved fast but controlled. No sprint, no panic. Ranger held his right front paw up, trembling slightly. Not screaming, not collapsing, just confused. Walter knelt in the grass. Easy, easy. He ran his hands down the leg gently. No bone shift, no swelling yet. Then he saw it. A thin strand of old fencing wire half hidden under dead grass. Rusted, coiled tight to the ground like a forgotten snare. Ranger had stepped straight into it. Walter's jaw tightened. Hold still. He untangled the wire carefully. The edge had scraped the pad, leaving a shallow cut. Blood beaded up but didn't run heavy. Not a trap, not fresh, just something left behind. But that didn't make it harmless. Walter lifted Ranger's paw and examined it under the fading light. You're okay, he murmured. You're okay. Ranger didn't pull away. He leaned into Walter's chest instead. Walter stood slowly, lifting the dog enough to take pressure off the paw. Ranger was heavy, solid, real. Inside the cabin, Walter laid him on the old blanket near the table. He pulled his small medical kit from the truck. Gauze, saline, vet wrap he'd carried since before the job at the warehouse. He cleaned the cut gently. Ranger watched him the whole time. Not whining, just steady. Should have seen it, Walter muttered. His voice wasn't anger at the dog. It was anger at himself. Out there years ago, wires hidden under dust had meant something very different. He'd trained his eyes to catch the unnatural line in natural ground. But this wasn't a desert road. It was Kentucky. And he had let his guard tilt toward the ridge instead of down at his feet. He wrapped the paw carefully, not too tight. You're off patrol tonight, he said softly. Ranger huffed once through his nose like he disagreed. Walter sat back against the wall and let the quiet settle. The ridge outside looked unchanged, but something inside him had shifted. It wasn't about land anymore. It was about risk. He stood and walked back to the dip in the yard with a shovel. The wire was old fencing, probably left from decades ago when someone had tried to run cattle up here. He pulled it free in long, careful strips, tossed it aside, dug up 2 more fragments he hadn't noticed before. Not deliberate, just forgotten, still dangerous. As dusk thickened, he noticed something else. Up along the slope, about 30 yards higher than the roadbed, A wooden stake stood where it hadn't been that morning. Fresh cut. Clean. He stared at it a long time. No tape. No flag. Just a marker. He walked toward it. The ground under his boots felt firmer than it had before, slightly compressed, like someone had walked that stretch more than once. Ranger limped after him despite the bandage. "Stay," Walter said gently. The dog ignored him and moved to Walter's left side anyway. Walter reached the stake and crouched beside it. The soil around it was still loose, recently driven. He looked downhill toward the cabin, then uphill toward the upper tract. If someone was marking future access points, they weren't being subtle anymore. They were mapping. Walter pulled the stake free and laid it flat across the buried gravel again. "Not yours," he said quietly. Ranger's ears twitched. A faint crunch came from deeper in the woods. Walter's head snapped up. "Contact," he whispered under his breath before catching himself. Old language. Old reflex. He scanned the trees slowly. Nothing moved. Then far off, the sound of an engine. Not on the main road. Higher. Up along the ridge line. The sound faded as quickly as it came. Walter exhaled once, slow. "They're checking ground conditions," he said. "Light loads first." He didn't know that for certain, but he knew patterns. Back inside the cabin, he settled Ranger near the bed and sat on the floor beside him. "You don't get hurt over dirt," he said softly. Ranger lifted his head and rested it against Walter's knee. The cut wasn't deep. The bandage held, but the image of that quick yelp replayed in his mind. Out there, danger had always come loud. Here, it came quiet. Wire in grass, a stake in soil, an offer too fast. Walter reached for his notebook again. Fresh stake found, removed. Wire hazard cleared. Engine heard ridge side, dusk. He wrote it all down. Not because anyone would read it, because facts kept fear from turning into something bigger. Outside, night fell fully. Walter stepped onto the porch one more time before turning in. The ridge lay dark and still. He didn't feel hunted. He felt measured. Someone was testing weight, terrain, reaction. And tonight, the cost had been a shallow cut on Ranger's paw. That was enough. Walter looked down at the old road hidden under grass. "If you're coming through," he said quietly to the dark, "you're doing it on paper." Ranger stepped up beside him despite the bandage. Walter rested a hand on the dog's neck. The ridge didn't answer, but it didn't feel empty anymore. It felt contested. Not with shouting, not with fences cut or signs nailed to trees, just with quiet pressure. Walter didn't wait for another call. The next morning, he drove into town and stopped outside a low brick building with a hand-painted sign that read, "Roy Pickett, Survey Consulting." Roy had to be pushing 70, thin, sun-worn, cap pulled low over eyes that had spent a lifetime reading tree lines and boundary stones. "You Hayes?" Roy asked without looking up from the map spread across his desk. Walter nodded. "Ridge Hollow," Roy said. "Heard Crockett's been circling up there." Walter didn't ask how he'd heard. "Need someone who knows what a road used to be," Walter said. Roy studied him a moment longer, then folded the map. "I'll bring my wheel." By midday, Roy's old pickup was parked beside the cabin. Ranger watched him carefully at first, then relaxed when Roy spoke low and even. "Good dog," Roy said. "Knows his line." Walter and Roy walked the easement together. Roy didn't look at the cabin. He looked at the ground. He scraped the grass back with the toe of his boot, then bent and brushed dirt aside with his hand. Gravel appeared in a clean strip. "Old roadbed," Roy said. "No doubt." "How wide?" Walter asked. Roy measured with the wheel, counting under his breath. "Wide enough for logging trucks," he said, "if you clear the brush." They moved slowly uphill. Ranger walked ahead despite the bandage, favoring the paw only slightly. He stayed on the gravel like he'd memorized it. Roy paused near the dip and glanced toward the upper ridge. "Terrain north side steep," he said. "If Crockett builds fresh access from their parcel, they're cutting heavy. Cost goes up." "And from here?" Walter asked. Roy pointed with his chin at the faint curve running through the trees. "From here, it's mostly clearing and grading. Existing base under there. Saves them a lot." Walter nodded. He didn't smile. He didn't need to. They continued up until the grass gave way to hardwood shade. The air cooled there, leaves thick underfoot. Roy stopped again and tapped a section with his boot. "See how the growth bends?" he said. "That's traffic memory. Even after years, soil compacts, roots adjust." Walter crouched beside him. He could see it now, a subtle difference in color and density. The land had been holding that line long before he ever knew it existed. "Crockett's survey crew been up here?" Roy asked casually. "Stake showed up yesterday," Walter said. "Pulled it." Roy grunted. "Means they're planning, or at least considering." Ranger stiffened. Walter followed the dog's gaze. Higher up the ridge, near where the easement met the upper parcel boundary, orange tape fluttered around a sapling. Roy narrowed his eyes. "That's not mine." They walked toward it. The tape was new, clean cut, tied tight. Roy crouched and examined the trunk. "Preliminary marking," he said, "probably assessing cut lines." "For timber?" Walter asked. "For access," Roy replied. "You don't move heavy equipment without marking turns and load angles." Walter stood slowly. The pieces weren't dramatic. They were logistical. "They didn't ask," he said. Roy looked at him carefully. "Did you put up no trespassing signs?" Walter shook his head. Roy nodded once. "Then legally, they're probably still in gray territory. Easement exists, but they don't get to expand it without agreement." Walter let that settle. Agreement. That meant leverage. They walked farther until the trees opened slightly, revealing a clear view of the slope beyond. The land behind the ridge stretched wide and uneven. Thick timber, rolling ground. Roy tapped the map he'd brought. "Upper tract's valuable," he said, "but only if it connects clean." Walter looked back down toward his cabin. From up here, it looked smaller, less important, except for the thin strip of land cutting through it. Ranger moved ahead and stopped at the edge of where gravel thinned into packed dirt. He stood square, chest out, staring downhill. Walter stepped beside him. "Road runs clean," Roy said. "That's your leverage." Walter exhaled slowly. Not relief. Clarity. "Can they force access?" he asked. Roy shook his head. "Not without court, and that's expensive, slower than negotiation." Walter nodded once. That was all he needed. As they headed back toward the cabin, Ranger trotted more confidently. The bandaged paw held steady. Roy stopped near the yard and looked at Walter. "You planning to sell?" he asked plainly. Walter looked out across the grass, following the roadbed with his eyes. "No," he said. Roy gave a thin smile. "Then you're in the stronger position. Just don't rush." After Roy left, Walter stood alone in the yard. The ridge didn't feel threatening anymore. It felt revealed. The old road wasn't a rumor. It was measurable, documented, practical. Ranger came to stand beside him again. Walter scratched behind his ear. "They thought I wouldn't look," he said. The dog blinked slowly. Walter glanced toward the upper ridge once more. He didn't see anyone, but he didn't need to. Crockett would know now that he knew. And that changed the equation. The path wasn't buried anymore. It was visible. And once something is visible, it's harder to pretend it doesn't matter. As the sun dipped lower, Walter walked the line one more time. Not as a patrol, as an owner. The gravel under grass no longer felt like a secret. It felt like ground. And for the first time since stepping onto Ridge Hollow, Walter Hayes didn't feel cornered. He felt positioned. Not aggressive. Not defensive. Just aware of where he stood. That feeling lasted until the sound of engines came up the drive. 2 trucks this time. Walter stepped off the porch before Ranger did. The dog followed half a step behind, bandage gone now, paw healed but gait still cautious on uneven ground. The first truck was the same silver SUV. The second was a white pickup with a company logo on the door. Crockett Timber Holdings. No more quiet circling. This was official. The vehicles stopped near the gate. Doors opened in sequence. Cliff stepped out first. Behind him, a man in a hard hat and pressed field jacket unfolded a clipboard. Walter stayed where he was. Ranger moved to his left side and sat. Straight-backed, alert. Cliff raised a hand. Not a wave. A signal. "Walter," he called. "Let's keep this simple." "That depends," Walter replied evenly. The man with the clipboard approached halfway across the yard and stopped when Ranger stood. "Mr. Hayes," he said, "I'm Daniel Mercer, Crockett Timber. We'd like to discuss access logistics." "Through my attorney," Walter said. Daniel glanced at Cliff, then back at Walter. "We're not here to strong-arm you," he said calmly. "We're here to clarify scope. The recorded easement allows passage. We'd like to survey it formally." Walter nodded once. "You can submit that request in writing." Cliff's patience thinned. "You're making this harder than it has to be." Walter didn't move. "No," he said. "I'm making it slower." Wind moved across the grass, bending it in a visible line along the buried road. Daniel followed the direction of the bend with his eyes. "We're not trying to take your cabin," he said. "Just establish a clean route to the upper tract." "And in exchange?" Walter asked. Daniel paused. "We compensate for access use. Standard practice." "How much?" Walter asked. Cliff cut in. "That depends on volume, timber yield, duration." Walter watched Daniel carefully. Not the words, the shoulders, the stance. "You already ran numbers," Walter said. Daniel didn't deny it. "We evaluate potential scenarios," he said. Ranger let out a low, warning growl. Daniel stopped one step short of the roadbed. "Good dog," he murmured. Walter's voice remained even. "You don't step past that line without permission." Daniel nodded. "Understood." The tension in the yard shifted. Less hostile, more transactional. Cliff tried again. "Look, Walter, we both know that road benefits us. It benefits you, too. Maintenance, grading, maybe even utilities down the line." Walter almost smiled. "You want to grade it," he said, "because you need weight capacity." Cliff's jaw flexed. Daniel held up a hand to slow him. "Let's walk it together," Daniel suggested. "No commitments, just visibility." Walter considered it. Walking the line didn't give them ownership. It gave him presence. "Fine," he said. "But no markers, no flags, no tape." Daniel nodded once. They moved uphill as a group. Cliff stayed half a step behind Daniel. Ranger stayed half a step in front of Walter. The roadbed felt firmer now that Walter had cleared portions of it. Gravel showed through in pale strips. Daniel crouched in 2 places, brushing aside dirt with practiced fingers. "Solid base," he said. "Old but stable." Roy's assessment echoed in Walter's mind. "Saves them a lot." They reached the stretch near the sapling, where the orange tape had fluttered days earlier. The tape was gone. Roy had removed it. Daniel noticed the stripped bark where it had been. "You had a surveyor up here?" he asked. "I did," Walter replied. Daniel nodded slowly. "Good." Cliff exhaled through his nose. Of course he did. They continued up to the point where the easement touched the upper parcel boundary. From there, the slope dropped slightly before leveling toward thicker timber. Daniel stood and looked out across it. "This would reduce build costs significantly," he said quietly. Cliff didn't speak. Walter did. "Then price it accordingly." Silence settled. Not uncomfortable, just clear. Daniel turned toward him. "We'd like to propose a controlled access agreement," he said. "Written terms, environmental protections, defined traffic limits." Walter studied him. "No heavy cut near the lower spring," he said. Daniel blinked. "There's a spring down there?" Walter held his gaze. "Yes." Daniel made a note on his clipboard. Cliff looked irritated. "This is getting complicated." Walter's voice didn't rise. "It was complicated when you tried to buy it for 30. Cliff didn't answer. They walked back down in quiet. At the yard, Daniel stopped near the porch. "I'll have a draft proposal sent to your legal contact," he said. "Nothing moves until you review." Walter nodded. "Nothing moves until it's signed." Daniel extended a hand. Walter hesitated only a second before shaking it. Firm, brief. Cliff lingered a moment longer. "You sure you want to stay up here?" he asked. Walter looked past him at the ridge. "Yes." Cliff studied him, then turned away. The trucks rolled back down the drive and disappeared beyond the gate. Silence returned. Ranger stepped forward and sniffed the fresh tire impressions in the yard. Then he looked up at Walter, waiting. Walter stood still for a long time. This wasn't a fight. It was leverage. He looked at the old road cutting through grass. "They came to the line," he said quietly. "And they stopped." Ranger sat again, calm now. The ridge no longer felt like a threat. It felt like a negotiation table. And Walter Hayes wasn't sitting at the edge anymore. He was sitting at the head, not of a boardroom table, not of a family gathering, but of his own land. The draft agreement arrived 3 days later, email first, then a printed copy delivered by courier to the post office box he'd set up in town. Walter didn't open it at the cabin. He drove into Russell County and met with a local attorney Roy had recommended. Small office, no polished marble floors, just shelves of binders and a woman named Carla Jennings who read every line twice before she spoke. Ranger lay at Walter's feet while Carla adjusted her glasses. "They're offering compensation for access use," she said. "Annual payment based on load volume, road maintenance included. Defined width. Defined hours of operation." Walter listened without interrupting. "And the spring?" he asked. Carla flipped pages. "They've added an environmental buffer clause. No equipment within 75 feet. Protective fencing allowed at your discretion." Walter nodded slowly. "And timber cut on my parcel?" "None without separate written consent," she said. "They've specified that clearly." Walter leaned back in his chair. Cliff had started with 30,000 and urgency. This was different. This was structured. "This doesn't give them ownership," he said. "No," Carla replied. "It gives them passage. Under your terms." Walter sat quietly for a long moment. "Add one thing," he said. "If road damage exceeds repair capacity, operations pause until fixed, on their cost." Carla smiled faintly. "I'll draft that amendment." By the time Walter left the office, the sky had turned overcast. Low clouds hung heavy over the courthouse square. Ranger jumped into the truck without hesitation this time. No stiffness in his step. no bandage. As they drove back up Ridge Hollow, Walter didn't feel tense. He felt deliberate. The cabin greeted them in quiet gray light. The roadbed was visible now in long, pale streaks where he had cleared grass. He walked the path again before dark. Not to patrol, to consider. The land no longer felt threatened. It felt engaged. 2 weeks later, the agreement was signed. No handshakes on the porch this time. Just paperwork exchanged across Carla's desk. Terms defined. Boundaries written. Responsibility assigned. Crockett would grade the existing roadbed lightly. No widening without consent. No tree removal on Walter's parcel beyond what was necessary for safe passage. Annual compensation deposited into his account each quarter. Nothing flashy. Nothing life-changing overnight. But steady. Back at the cabin, the first maintenance crew arrived under clear skies. 2 men, 1 grader, 1 pickup. They stuck to the defined strip. Walter watched from the porch, Ranger beside him. The grader smoothed the gravel, packed it tight, left the surrounding grass untouched. Walter didn't interfere. He just observed. By sunset, the path looked different. Not new, just acknowledged. The next weeks passed in rhythm. Timber trucks rolled through at scheduled hours. Never at night. Never before sunrise. Walter counted loads in his notebook. Ranger lay near the porch steps and watched each vehicle pass. No barking now, just awareness. The first payment hit his account at the end of the quarter. Walter stared at the number for a long moment. It wasn't wealth. It was stability. He drove to town and bought roofing shingles, replaced the worst patches on the cabin himself. Slow work. Careful. Ranger stayed close, shifting out of the way when Walter climbed the ladder. "You're off duty," Walter said once when Ranger tried to follow him up the steps. The dog sat instead, watching the yard like he'd been assigned. The porch boards were next. Walter reinforced the sagging corner, leveled it with fresh lumber and bolts. The cabin didn't become modern. It became solid. Inside, he installed a small propane heater, fixed the back door latch, replaced the old kitchen faucet that had dripped steadily since he arrived. Each repair felt less like survival, more like intention. Cliff didn't call again. Crockett's trucks followed the schedule. Roy stopped by once to check grading depth. Nodded approvingly. "Good agreement," he said. "You held ground." Walter didn't answer. He didn't feel triumphant. He felt steady. One morning he stood on the cleared road and looked down toward the gate. The path no longer hid under grass. It ran visible and firm from cabin to ridge. Ranger trotted beside him, tail relaxed. The laughter from that lawyer's office felt distant now. Not erased, just quiet. Walter closed his eyes for a moment. He listened. No engines, no crunch of tires. Just wind moving through timber. For years, silence had meant threat. Now it meant space. He opened his eyes and looked down at Ranger. "Different kind of fight," he said softly. Ranger leaned against his leg. Walter understood something then. He hadn't won by pushing harder. He'd won by refusing to rush. The land didn't need to be conquered. It needed to be understood. That evening, as the sun dipped low behind the ridge, Walter stood at the edge of the spring buffer zone and watched the water move clean and steady. The trucks had come and gone. The road had held, and he had stayed. The ridge wasn't something to survive anymore. It was something to build on. Walter turned back toward the cabin, Ranger pacing at his side. For the first time since stepping onto Ridge Hollow, he didn't feel like a man reacting to noise. He felt like a man choosing where to stand. That feeling didn't arrive with fireworks. It didn't come the day the papers were signed or when the first check cleared. It came slowly. One morning, months later, Walter stepped out onto the porch before sunrise. The air was cold enough to sting the inside of his lungs. The ridge was washed in pale blue light. Ranger moved past him and trotted down the roadbed that now ran clean and firm through the grass. Not wide, not overbuilt, just clear. Walter watched him go. The path no longer felt like a fault line between people. It felt like a spine. The cabin behind him stood straight now. The roof no longer sagged. The porch didn't dip under weight. The new heater hummed softly inside, steady and reliable. Nothing about it was grand, but nothing about it was fragile either. Walter walked down the road until he reached the spring buffer. The water ran clear between stones, fenced and protected, just like the agreement required. Ranger lapped once from the edge, then looked back as if asking permission. "Go on," Walter said. The dog stepped into the shallow water, careful but confident. Walter leaned against a tree and let his shoulders drop. There were still trucks some days, still schedules, still paperwork, but the rhythm had changed. No one came without notice. No one marked trees without approval. No one spoke about the land like it was an afterthought. He had insisted on that. Not with anger, with patience. Later that week, Cliff showed up alone. No SUV, no company truck, just his own pickup. He stopped at the gate and waited this time. Walter walked down the drive to meet him. Ranger stayed beside him, calm. Cliff didn't smile. "You handled it smart," he said. Walter didn't answer right away. "I handled it slow," he said instead. Cliff glanced up at the ridge. "Didn't think you'd stick around," he admitted. Walter looked at the cabin behind him. "I didn't either," he said. Cliff nodded once, then turned back toward his truck. That was all. No apology, no argument, just acknowledgement. When Cliff drove away, Walter didn't feel vindicated. He felt settled. The ridge didn't need anyone's approval now. It knew who lived on it. Weeks turned into seasons. Walter planted a small vegetable patch beside the cabin. Nothing ambitious, just enough to give his hands work. He fixed the back steps properly, replaced the old screen door, added a simple wooden bench facing the valley. In the evenings, he sat there with a mug of coffee while Ranger stretched out at his feet. Sometimes, when a truck passed along the roadbed, Walter felt the old tightening in his chest. The reflex. He would pause. Listen. Then remind himself. Scheduled. Documented. Within terms. The noise no longer meant danger. It meant structure. One afternoon, as the sun dipped behind the ridge, Walter stood at the top of the cleared road and looked down toward the gate. From there, he could see the entire path. The same strip that had been buried under grass now caught the light in a pale line from tree to cabin. Ranger ran at full speed once, just because he could. He reached the bottom, turned sharply, and raced back up, tail high. Walter laughed. It surprised him. The sound didn't feel forced. It felt earned. He crouched when Ranger reached him, pressing both hands into the thick fur along his neck. "You kept me steady," he said quietly. Ranger leaned into him without hesitation. Walter stood again and looked out across the ridge. He thought about the warehouse floor, the pallet crashing down, the noise that had sent him somewhere he didn't want to go. He thought about the lawyer's office, the laughter, the easy dismissal. He thought about the thin strip of gravel under grass that had changed everything. This land had not healed him overnight. It hadn't erased the past, but it had given him something solid to stand on when the noise came back. And the noise still came sometimes. At night, a branch snapping could still make his heart kick. But now, when he stepped outside and looked across the ridge, he saw more than shadow. He saw the road he had cleared. He saw the spring he had protected. He He saw the cabin he had rebuilt with his own hands. He saw a dog who had never once stepped away from his side. That mattered. Walter rested his hands on his hips and let the last light slide across the trees. The ridge was quiet, not empty, not contested, just still. He looked down at Ranger, who stood beside him, ears forward, watching the valley below. Walter nodded once. "Clear," he said. This time it wasn't a reflex, it was a decision, and the ridge in its own quiet way seemed to agree. Walter didn't win by fighting harder. He didn't win by shouting louder. He won by slowing down when others rushed him, by asking questions when others laughed, by standing still when it would have been easier to walk away. And he never stood alone. Ranger didn't negotiate contracts. He didn't understand easements or timber rights, but he understood loyalty. He understood staying close. He understood that when the world feels loud and uncertain, sometimes the strongest thing you can do is stand your ground beside someone who needs you. This story isn't about land. It's about dignity, about not letting people decide your worth because they don't see what you see, about patience being stronger than pride, about protecting what matters, even if it looks small from the outside. Sometimes healing doesn't come from moving on. Sometimes it comes from choosing to stay. If you were in Walter's place, would you have sold the land? 0 for yes, 1 for no? Tell me why in the comments. And if stories like this speak to you, you're welcome to stay a little longer. There are more journeys ahead, about loyalty, second chances, and the quiet strength people carry when no one is looking. Thanks for walking the ridge with us.